This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Hi there, thanks ever so much for having me along. I feel quite embarrassed because I've not been to one of these events before, and I feel that maybe I should have because most of my career has been in special collections, so I feel that, you know, archivists are a very big presence in my life, but I just haven't pitched up at anything quite like this before. We weren't quite sure, Jenny and I weren't quite sure who would actually come and what their interest might be. I know there's a couple of people who are actually, like me, librarians, sort of coming along, but I'm just not sure, is everybody else coming from a sort of traditional archives background, or? Yeah? You're librarians as well, okay, because it's just to know like where to pitch it. So in terms of, I'll just give a brief overview of, like, in sort of one sentence, what's been happening in library cataloguing, which is basically since 2008 there's been a move towards a new standard called Resource Description and Access, RDA, and on the back of that, and in reaction to that, we're now moving away from the standard form of computer cataloguing in libraries, machine readable cataloguing, MARC, and towards something else which at the moment is being examined by the Library of Congress under a scheme called the Bibliographics Framework Initiative, or BibFrame. So that's the kind of area that I'm going to talk about. Does that sound, apart from you two over there, who that will sound really familiar to because you're my students, does that sound like hopelessly, like really kind of like a well-worn path that you all know about, or do speak up if it does? And if at any point I'm going over stuff that seems really obvious, do say. My experience working with archivists professionally really was brought to the pointy end when I was recruited into the Public Record Office library at a time of great change, and so I had that experience of being in charge of a teeny tiny library nested within a massive archive, which has been a great bonding experience for every archivist that I've ever met since, because it seems to be a common experience of archivists to work in a small archive that is part of some sort of bigger library situation. So one of the things that really made me appreciate was how often we use the same words to mean different things. And we use different words to mean the same things. So if it seems like I'm spelling things out, that's the reason why I'm spelling things out. I mean, the clear sort of big sort of elephant in the room is that word documentation, which to archivists and librarians, you know, there's a Venn diagram in which overlaps. But you know, I wouldn't like to have to chair a debate on what is documentation with all the people in this room, because we would quickly get onto a sticky wicket. So instead, I'm going to talk, as Jenny says, about library cataloguing, and about, really I want to focus on two things: a kind of ethos that's different, because I think certainly for younger members of the two professions it's not always clear, you know, what's different in the fundamental principles of the two disciplines. And then I'm going to whiz on to some of the more technical, with a small t, changes that have been happening. So not what's happening with computers in that sense of technical, but technical in the sense that obviously cataloguing and bibliographic services are part of technical services within libraries. Okay, and just stop me, ask questions at any point, contribute if you think I'm saying things that are, you know, crazy or mad, or that you disagree with. Like Jenny, I'm a university lecturer, so I've got a very thick skin. Despite it being lovely white Scottish skin, it's very, very thick. So do just chip in, okay? So in terms of when we say library cataloguing, I think it's always worthwhile to start with Ranganathan, who was one of UCL's greatest graduates. He went on to publish quite widely in the realms of information theory. And his 5 laws are really quite straightforward but extremely profound. So in his day, he was writing in the 1930s and 1950s, so excuse the gendered pronouns and the fact that everything is a book rather than a resource. We can change genders and substitute the word resource for books. But Ranganathan always says, books are for use. Every book its reader, every reader his book, save the time of the reader, and a library is a growing organism. And I always tell the students that really should be fundamental within everything that we do, and particularly if we're in what used to be called the back room of the library. I say what used to be because now, with the advent of the digital era, really what used to be in the back room in all of those kind of card boxes is now often the first and sometimes the only interaction that users have with the library. So now the back room is the front room, if that makes sense. So it's this idea that we have this conglomeration of stuff that people might want to find. Different people might want to find it for different reasons. And that stuff is there for a purpose, which again, there's an overlap there with archives not being static. A big difference between libraries and archives that I've observed is the fact that books and printed materials and a lot of audiovisual materials are published in the sense of being mass-produced objects. And even although I come from a special collections background and have had the curation of certain items which are the only one extant or known to be extant at the time of their production, they were mass-produced, whether even in the hand press era, 200 books was mass-produced compared to writing a letter or even scribal practice. So I think there's a fundamental difference there in terms of how the two professions have developed and in how we do documentation with a small d because of that. Okay. I think the biggest difference between library cataloguing and archival cataloguing, as far as I can make it out, is really summed up by a quote from David Hayes and Alan Hopkinson in 2006 in the Library Association's main journal update, and it was entitled, it's a practitioner article entitled "Librarians Need Standards." And they said, to a large extent, the practice of librarianship is defined by standards. They enable library and information workers to follow similar practices to their colleagues elsewhere, helping both themselves and their users. Using AACR, the Anglo-American cataloguing rules, and MARC, machine-readable cataloguing, enables records to be transferred between systems. This saves having to create all catalogue records from scratch. Common cataloguing standards mean readers are able to search catalogues everywhere in a similar manner. Now, I know within archival practice there's encoded archival description, and some of the principles in use there around standardisation and ways of approaching things are similar. But the core difference, I think, is this idea that has cropped up within libraries that somewhere in the world someone else is cataloguing what you're cataloguing, and therefore it will be much quicker, easier and cheaper for your institution to just download that record and, as we say in the trade, tart it up for local use. And I think there's been a great deal of pressure that's put onto librarians in charge of cataloguing from that assumption, and I do think it's an assumption. So back in 1852, when we were still in the days of writing out records, whether in book form or in card form, Charles Jewett, who was a librarian at the Smithsonian, published a seminal report in 1852, the Smithsonian Report on the Construction of the Catalogues of Libraries and of a General Catalogue and their publication by means of separate stereotyped titles with rules and examples. And in that he said, minute and stringent rules become absolutely indispensable when the catalogue of each library is to form part of a general catalogue. Uniformity is then imperative, but among many labourers can only be secured by the adherence to rules embracing as far as possible all details of the work. And as part of that study, there's an interesting statistic that's buried, quite a long way down. So obviously the Smithsonian is located in a part of America where there's fantastic research libraries all around it. And as part of that study, one of the things that he did was to look and compare his holdings at the Smithsonian with other research libraries in the area, including Harvard, which, as we know, is one of the biggest research libraries in the world, and certainly in North America. And even on doing that comparison, and even although the institutions in terms of who was using them had a huge overlap in terms of individuals who would use both institutions and the type of individual that were using those institutions, the figure that he came up with was 40% So back in 1852, he found that there was only 40% of the book stock that was identical. So this idea of uniformity and of having a shared general catalogue, which he really is credited with being the main driver behind in America and flowing through to over here. He, as the founding father of that idea, didn't think that somewhere in the world there was always going to be somebody else cataloguing the books that he was dealing with. He thought 40% of the time there was going to be somebody else. So within the kind of library administration world, where we're not allowed to catalogue from scratch because it's commonplace, I think that's worth bearing in mind. So in terms of, what does that mean for us today? Well, we're coming out of the Anglo-American cataloguing era, really. And what do I mean by that? Well, the cataloguing codes developed in America and in the UK have been used elsewhere across the English language world. Famous ones include Jewett's rules that I've just mentioned, Panizzi's 91 rules from the British Library or British Museum as it then was, Cutter's rules for a printed dictionary catalogue, and then we start to see the associations getting involved. So the American Library Association and the Library Association here both published independently standards that should be used or could be used. The Bodleian Library is famous for its working cataloguing standards, the Vatican rules. So there's a plethora that crops up in the late 19th, early 20th century as the library world is groping around. And then ultimately we come together in the 1960s with the publication of the Anglo-American cataloguing rules, which then goes into a second edition and several second revised editions. Fundamental to that, and again, shout if this is stuff that you all know because we're starting to get into an area that I think is well known in archives, there's the International Standard Bibliographic Description, which is the set of rules that talks mainly about punctuation. And as I always describe it to students, the punctuation that we see in a catalogue record in Greece, in Greek script, is exactly the same as the punctuation that we would see in London or in France or in Czechoslovakia. So that we can look at a catalogue record, whether it's written out or on the computer, and we can see this line here is the main title. There's a colon, which means that what follows will be the subtitle. There's a space, oblique space, which means what follows is a statement of responsibility. So who's written it, who's responsible for the illustrations, that sort of thing. So all of this came into being in the 1960s and early 1970s, as well as the statement of principles adopted at the International Cataloguing Principles Conference in Paris in 1961. So that was very much the era that was there, and it was an era that was based on picking up a resource and describing that resource that you had in your hand. And there was some concern as to how that resource would relate to other resources, but it was very much at a document level, if that makes sense. So this book here, to exemplify from my own book, which I brought along in case of awkward questions, I can look at this and I can see it's got a title and it's got two authors, and so there's a relationship. Any other books that I've written or my co-author have written in some way are related to this particular book. It's published by a particular publisher, so other books published by that publisher are in some ways related to this book. But it was very much at a document level. So again, there might be an edition statement, but you're really looking at, you're creating a record that I would call monolithic, and that's how it's always going to be seen. And as computerization comes in and changes, we get facilities for doing interesting things with that monolith. So the first thing that we have, excuse me for the low tech, it's because I didn't know what the audience would be like, so I wasn't sure. So the first thing that we see is, so if we've got a monolithic record, in early days of computerization, that's what you have, and it's stored in a database. And the database, these might be related to other things. But then you come along, so that's your bib record, but then we develop to the point where the relational database is sophisticated enough that you can have a holdings record. And this bib record will be the same whether it's sitting in the Bodleian or UCL or the Library of Congress, but the holdings might be different because obviously the individual copies at UCL and the Bodleian and the Library of Congress might be different. And then sitting above that, within this old-fashioned now, but it was revolutionary at the time, is the authority data, which is a bad word, I know, to a lot of archivists. A lot of my friends are really polarised along this idea of whether authority data is the best thing since sliced bread and is going to save them lots of work, or is just another heading. But basically what the user sees draws on all of this. So your authority data will say, you know, that the Anne Welsh who wrote this is the same Anne Welsh who wrote the next book that's due out on cataloguing, not the same Anne Welsh that wrote A Children's Guide to Stopping Smoking, right? Being able to disambiguate like that is something that's been quite important. And what the user sees on the individual catalogue, however it's put out, will be, you'll have your bib record, so this whole thing here will be the bib record, it's served up. Your authority data will come in here, so it'll be like the name of the author perhaps will be pulled through from the authority data, and then your holdings data will be here. So to the end user, the computer serves up on the fly something that looks monolithic but actually is in 3 parts on a standard library catalogue. Okay? Now we're moving faster than we can cope with really into the electronic era, and what we want to be able to do is pull that apart even further. We want to be able to say, if we've got a record here and it's got, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 lines of data on it, we want to pull that apart and say, well, over here there's something. So perhaps we've got the name of somebody or of an organisation. We want to be able to pull that apart and go, what else do we know about that name? And we might want to pull that in from somewhere else on the World Wide Web. It's a really bad picture of the world, but hopefully we get the drift, right? And similarly, so you might have cataloguing, you know, might be the subject or the title of it. And again, we might want to pull that in again from somewhere on the World Wide Web. Okay, and of course the elephant in the room is SCOS, this idea that things should be SCOSable, that everything can be related. So if you've got a list of like UDC, for example, over here that deals with particular topics, and you've got a wealth of data here, there's just a mass of stuff that you can pull via SCOS across from here to here and make sense of your data. Okay, so this idea of the world of linked data at that field by field by field level. Okay, so there's a real driver for that in libraries, which I'm not sure, I don't know what you think. Is that the same in archives? Are archivists being pressured to sort of pull that monolithic structure apart and reconstitute it in different ways?
Yes and no.
Yeah, I think there are many of us who want to be able to do that.
They are, but I mean, yes, at the level of individual data elements, we now have sort of field names for data elements and coding schemas for various data elements. So we do go down to that sort of line by line, data element by data element. But I think, yeah, we still have this monolith in the room, which is called the fonts, and we can't really get rid of it. Well, we try, but we can't really get rid of it. So I think that's our monolith in the room.
Yeah. And I think my perception from the outside is that your monolith is a bit stronger than the library cataloguing monolith. I would say it would be a fair, it's a simplification, but it would be a fair simplification to say that the majority of people active in cataloguing and cataloguing theory within libraries see this as a good thing. It's the unusual person, and I know the unusual person who has very good arguments against this, and I do tend to see his point, but it's the unusual person that says, no, actually the monolith is what the user understands, let's keep the monolith.
I think archivists are generally trapped by legacy data.
Yeah. And I'm sure that's true of librarians too. I come from the British Library, so I know that's true of my bibliographic colleagues. Yeah, absolutely.
But I have to say, what's SCOS? Sorry, you're going to have to explain.
I can never remember what the acronym stands for, but it's one of the main standards that's used for linked data. So if you Google SCOS, it'll come up with lots of different data sets. And as I say, the basic principle is that, you know, somebody over in Japan has created a wonderful ontology that you want to apply to your data, and it's an HTML-based or XML-based standard that can pull that data through and allow you to apply that with some tweaking to your data. And it's huge at the moment. It's a real driver.
Standard for ontologies.
Yes.
That's a good way to put it.
That was simple knowledge organisations, something system.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yes.
Yeah,
That's
something like that. Okay, so within libraries it's really accepted that this is where they want to go, and there's a whole load of articles being published around the idea that we shouldn't have our data sitting in silos, and that there's a lot sitting on library management systems that would be of use to the world, and that the ethos of librarianship should include sharing that data. So that's really, from an intellectual standpoint, it's that idea that underpins it. However, what we are stuck with, and I always say to the students, that the archivists did the sensible thing, because libraries got on board with computerization really before computers were really any good at all of this relational data stuff. So the MARC standard, machine readable standard, had its genesis in the 1950s, which, if you think about how long computers have been around for corporate use, it really is right at the forefront of that. So in 1966, the machine readable cataloguing project was set up by the Library of Congress, and it sent data on tape, you know, the great big reel-to-reel tapes that they used to have in the 1960s. So they sent data from the Library of Congress to 16 libraries across the United States to see how that would work to share the data. And at the same time, the British National Bibliography, which at that time was a section of the British Library and still is, as part of it was really coming into its own then, the BNB. And one of the big research packages that it did that really gave it an identity, so that it wasn't just this kind of nerdy data bit of the British Library, was the MARC trials in the UK. So they weren't as spectacular in terms of quantity as the United States, but in terms of, you know, the British Library having a foot in the camp and being able to talk to the Library of Congress, it did the job. So that in 1968, the Library of Congress and the British National Bibliography came together and formed MARC II, which is written MARC and then II, so the Roman II rather than the Arabic numeral II. And that aimed to be an Anglo-American format. So the Anglo-American cataloguing rules, the standard for how we describe the data, were coming out at the same time as this new computer standard was coming out. Okay, which was slightly chaotic, but it seemed to work. And then between 1968 and 1998, over 50 different formats of MARC came into being. So the basic format of MARC, whatever part of the world you're in, whatever language group you're in, is always that you've got a tag, which will be a number. So you've got your tag, and then you've got an indicator, or you may have an indicator. Some tags do, some don't. So that'll always be like 2. You can have a maximum of 2, and then you've got your fields, and the fields have got subfield delimiters. So it's either a dollar or a pipe mark A, $B, $C, pipe mark B, pipe mark C, and that's how it's structured. And the idea behind that was, in these really clunky old-style relational databases, such as the one that I drew on the left there, it was really hard to hold the data rigid. What the MARC projects had both shown was that, just for unknown reasons, all the tech could be set up perfectly, but the reel-to-reel tapes, and then even when we went to CD-ROM, there was just data drops and things would fall out and be garbled. And if you've ever had that experience of looking at a library catalogue and there's just gobbledygook, one of 2 things has happened. It's been a tape that's been received and uploaded, and it's just, for some reason, there's been a data drop, or they've tried to update the catalogue and they've done a batch modify and it's garbled it. The other thing that's worth bearing in mind if you're an archivist is the sheer quantity of data that we're talking about here. So in cataloguing, I worked for a library supply company immediately after library school, and our cataloguing targets were 400 books a week each. So every member of staff had to catalogue from scratch 400 books. And that's not uncommon. Now, most of them would be simple modern books like this. I'm not talking about, Gutenberg's Bible, right? If you work in special collection, that's why many of us get into special collections, is because you have the luxury of being able to spend time with the material. But if what you're talking about is really standard material, especially the zenith of British publishing was 1950s to 1970s, and if you hear anybody who was cataloguer in that era talk, it sounds really simple, because in those days the publishers knew the rules as well. So everything had an ISBN, or the majority of things had an ISBN. They knew what corporate bodies were, so they knew how to describe organisations. They understood about authority data. Now it's just a bit of a free-for-all. So in those days, 400 books a week was the target. Audio-visual material, you got a dispensation. I very quickly moved into audio-visual because there was a dispensation 200 items a week, because you had to take the material, like for the length of it and title, not from the container, but from actually watching the title credits of the film, if it was a film you were looking at. So you got a dispensation down to 200 items a week. Okay, so that's the quantity. So I think often in the conversations between archivists and librarians, that can drop out of the equation, this idea that, when I'm talking with my rare books hat on to an archivist, what I'm doing is really, really similar. I'm dealing with material that is prized and treasured and going to be accessed by scholars, and you build this beautiful record that will allow scholars to access it. When I'm thinking about modern books, I'm not. I'm doing something that's really quick and simple, and we'll throw it out there, and we'll worry 200 years later when that stuff becomes old and rare and scholars want to use it. Okay, so it's quantity. Quantity is the demon. So between 98 and 2001, we saw the harmonization of the United States mark, CAN mark, and UK mark to form Mark 21, which is not the 21st version of Mark, but Mark for the 21st century, which is quite poignant because Mark isn't going to make it very far into the 21st century by the looks of things now. So that's Mark, and that's the container. So what we've got in the library world is a set of Anglo-American standards that decide, what is the information that I take from the book or from the, film or whatever it is that I'm cataloguing. And then we have Mark that dictates how do I put it in to that framework. Okay, so Mark has been our container. I always think that Mark nests around our data and keeps it safe.
And archivists did play with Mark for a bit.
Yes.
So one of those formats was Mark AMC, which was Archives Manuscripts Control, and we played with it. And they got on with it in the States, but we didn't really get on with it here.
It's too rigid for archives, isn't it? For the type of information that you have to record.
There are all sorts of reasons why it didn't catch on. But I think the reason why archivists then moved away from Mark was because they realised that Mark had a constituency purely within the library field, and we were adopting a technology XML, which was a larger constituency.
Exactly, and I think that's the thing that, the archive community, I always say to our students in the Library Information Studies programme, the archive community basically sat back until the technology was right or closer to being right to actually do what they needed it to do. And I always think from a cataloguing principles point of view, how things should really work is you start with nothing but some resources you need to describe. You work out how to describe them and you build the technology around it. Now in the library world, my claim is that we leapt too soon, and the technology that we needed to build around what we needed to do wasn't there, and we made do with this Mark instead. Whereas in the archival world, and the time I was at the Public Record Office was just before EAD really took off, and you could see the different thought process around this. SGML just wasn't going to be good enough. It really had to be XML to give the flexibility. Now, I'm not an expert in archival documentation. The one thing that I've looked at closely is collections descriptions, and I think if you take a collection description and try and put it into Mark, one of those two things, or possibly both of those two things, will break. I think when I see collection descriptions that have been massaged into Mark, it's just horrific. It's the equivalent of taking a really good quality Scots whisky and putting iron brew in it. You're taking two delicious things and corrupting them, right? So that's where we're at. So now, having had, in some ways, we could say that the archival community was playing catch up with the library community to get computerization. Now, I would argue that the boot is on the other foot, and now the library community wants to be XML. It's played around with Mark XML, which hasn't taken off. And also there's been a lot of the library management systems, you set an input in Mark, but then there's scripts that run in the background, so overnight there will be a script that runs that converts all of the beautiful, pristine, clunky Mark records into XML that is thrown out onto the web. So another issue that we have in libraries quite commonly is what the end user is seeing on their public interface bears a resemblance, but it's only a passing resemblance to what's actually happening at the input stage, and anybody who knows anything about data input whatsoever will tell you that that's a really dangerous place to be. So all those times you're in a library and you've looked something up and you go and you say something to the librarian and you think, gosh, they're just looking up what I've looked up, and they come out with a different answer, it's probably because their back-end system that they're accessing is a very different beast from what you can see as a member of the public. So there's issues around that. So what's the solution? Well, the solution that we've been left with, whether we like it or not, is this new standard resource description and access. Now that is taking over as we speak from the Anglo-American cataloguing rules. It started its life in 2005 as ACR3, so the third edition of the Anglo-American cataloguing rules. And within it you'll hear librarians or cataloguers certainly talking about ACR style changes versus RDA style changes, and you'll think, what on earth do they mean? So the ACR3 stuff is things like, since the Anglo-American cataloguing rules second edition came out, new formats have arisen, like USB sticks, for example. So everybody pretty much in the cataloguing community wanted it documented, what's different about a USB stick and how do you deal with it. So that's like a kind of third edition of ACR type decision that's been made. The RDA style stuff is to move to a completely different mental model for cataloguing. So as I said, their mental model since the 19th century has been, I've got this thing, how do I describe it, and to give limited relationship to other things. Okay. Now what we're moving to is functional requirements for bibliographic records, or FRBR as it's abbreviated to. And in that, the emphasis to try and get us to this field by field linkage that we want, the emphasis is to think about bigger concepts. So the bigger concepts are worded, and I apologise for the jargon. So you've got a work level, and that's kind of the thing as it was imagined by the creator. So the example I use is Frankenstein. So at some point when Mary Shelley was writing Frankenstein, it existed as a work in her mind. That work, now I'm going to look at my notes because whenever I write on the board I always write the wrong thing, but that work then has to, I can do it out of my head, I'll stop if I get it wrong, it has to be expressed. And so we say it's an expression. That then has to become a manifestation. Right, here we go, this is where I just want to apologise for my whole profession, right? So now we talk about WEMI. Okay? So we talk about the work, so things can be linked at work level. Things could be an expression, so that would be like the manuscript version of Frankenstein that came out and was published. It's then manifested, and normally in library cataloguing we're kind of sitting somewhere around the manifestation item level. It's a good rule of thumb, there are exceptions. So it's manifested, it's something that you can hold in your hand, and what you're holding in your hand, so that book of mine is the same as every other book of, that's come off the press at the same time. But then at the item level, it's owned by me, as opposed to the copy that's owned by UCL, and that one's got my name written inside of it, and UCL's will have the stamp in it. So usually in library cataloguing we now say we're sitting somewhere around about here documenting these things. Okay? So it gets really, really complicated at a theoretical level, and I can only apologise for that. So the example that I always give is of Frankenstein. You can probably tell from my sense of dress that I'm going to be a lover of Gothic fiction. So as I say, at the work level, it's the idea in Mary Shelley's head of Frankenstein itself. The original expression would be the text that she completed in 1817. I'm not good at dates, so I always have to look up dates. So it would be the original expression that she completed in 1817. And then you've got several manifestations. So for example, in 1818, there was an original manifestation in English, but there was a second manifestation by a different publisher, but it's ostensibly the same text, in 1823. So those things, those two manifestations, are related to the expression that sits above them, and then off of each of those there will be individual items. Okay, I know that sounds hideous, doesn't it?
Can you have multiple expressions of a single work?
You could do, and that's why Frankenstein is a good example, because it's one of those books where obviously she revisited her manuscript and revised it to such a level it has a different ending and there's really significant changes within it. And so of the work Frankenstein, there are at least two expressions, and then each of those two expressions have got different manifestations.
So you're saying that every new edition of a standard work would be a separate manifestation?
Not necessarily every new edition. It's not quite a one-to-one relationship. It has to be a substantial change. So as a librarian, one of the things that drives you insane is all of these publishers who bring out new editions of books and there's like 2 words have changed. So that would probably still sit at the manifestation level. So it really is a complete, so when you see library cataloguers who are walking around looking in pain, you now know why they're looking in pain. So this model has been sitting around since the 1990s, but not implemented until 2008. We saw the first draft of Resource Description and Access was released, and they adopted this model within that. It can be quite useful for those of us who are audio-visual people. It can be very useful because in terms of if you've got a screenplay, how is that related to the book? Well, with the monolithic record, it's quite difficult to perform accurate linkages. If I'm looking for Jane Eyre, the book, the actual original text, I'm probably not looking for the film. But by having this model, it is argued, you can tell I'm not a fan, but it is argued that by having this model you can have different expressions. So Jane Eyre is the work, and obviously the film would be one expression and the text would be another. So it allows, if your catalogue is then empowered to do linkage at that level, it allows for interesting things to be done. And it's always been a problem within libraries, that type of query, because for every user who only wants the text, there will be maybe 9 other users who I just want the story of Jane Eyre. I don't care if it's a film or a podcast or the actual text itself, or if it's on a Kindle. And that's really the key thing, that the driving force is this idea of the content and the carrier being separated out. So if something is contained, so if I have, I've got these slides here that I brought with me. So these are on paper, but the actual content is the same as what's in the electronic file. But the fact that one's in an electronic file and one's on paper is a significant thing that should be recorded in its own right. So it's trying to enter in, it's the library world, I always say it's the library world trying to do philosophy, which is pretty much always a bad idea. It's trying to enter into that debate there. So what's happened is we've got this new standard that's come out that's trying to allow us to perform these linkages, and trying to allow us to get to an XML based place. And the stage we're at is we've got the content standard. So just as I said, we had MARC came out at the same time as the Anglo-American cataloguing rules, and that must have been a nightmare. And when you see the letters to the Library Journal in the States and to the Library Association record over here, people are in real pain. Formal 1960s men in bowler hats, or you can tell they were weeping onto the pages as they were writing these letters in. And it seems that we haven't learned the lesson, because we're trying to do the same thing. So we've got the standard RDA, but we're still stuck with our clunky MARC records. So at the moment it's quite hard. We're trying to massage this powerful tool into this clunky standard, And there's a little bit of politics, because by doing that, that has allowed the Library of Congress to go, oh my, you know, we wanted to do this really cool thing. We haven't got the tools for it. Could you give us some money to investigate the right tools for it? And that's what's current now. What you'll hear now is people talking about two things. Hashtag death of Mark, or hashtag Mark is dead, which people, the ones who are kind of Mark is dead, are quite gleeful about it. And BibFrame, so the Bibliographic Frameworks Initiative from the Library of Congress. And that is trying to build a relationship that simplifies this idea of WEMI. And what they talk about, and I do need to look at this because this is so new, I definitely can't do this out of my head. So they take a model that looks similar to the one on the left and similar to that, and they have in the middle of the network of data, they have the work. And then if you use RDF triples, this will look very scarily familiar. So works almost always have some form of creator. If I could write, it would help. And to check that out, you would need to check the authority file. Okay. Works, in order for us to be having them in the library world, right? We're not cataloguing what's in people's brains. So you have to, so it has instance, really bad, I hate that, it all just runs together like some weird computer speak. So then you've got instance sitting here, and then from that instance you would have lots of useful information. So you might have like the publisher, and you might have where it's published, and this is starting to look a bit XML-y presumably. You can imagine as archivists the XML file that is going to contain this, and it's going to have a format, and then each of those things will have their own authority file sitting a little bit further out. I'm going to get bored. Okay, so it's this really weird, well, really weird to us because it's so new, model. Okay, so what they're saying is that as in a library, you'll be looking at an instance, and you're trying to supply this type of information about it. And so again, what you're talking about there is, again, you're sitting, an instance is always going to be at that manifestation item level, so that maps across to there. Okay. But this is very new. This idea of BibFrame is still being debated, but that's what's being put forward at the moment. And it's claimed that by moving to an XML standard, and you as archivists can tell me how true you think this is or not, but by moving to an XML standard, we will gain granularity, extensibility, and we'll avoid technical marginalisation, which is what you were hinting at, Jenny, that basically libraries have been technologically marginalised, which I think is a fair thing. So I don't know if that's true. I don't know if you find that working with EAD gives you granularity and extensibility.
Extensibility probably in the future. I will when you stop working with it. As you see with that. Yeah. There's some future proofing there.
But I think the question is then breaking it down again, because if you're talking about creating an XML that has all of that in, then you're putting it back together again. The granularity is sometimes difficult. If you're trying to get to this everything is free floating and it all relates to each other model, then you're putting it in an XML document, then you're already imposing structure and relating things within the document.
EAD by its very nature is a monolith. That's what it does. And again, it increasingly is getting fed by bits of data from different places to build it, which is good, because then that means we can also build other things.
And this is the idea. So the idea is that you can pull off any of those triples, from one data set and plug them into another, if you have the technological capability. So that's the idea that we really want to get to. And it's this idea of the web of linked data. That's really where we're heading. And I know in the archive world that's really important as well. So what's been published, if you're interested in all of this, the key document that you want is commonly referred to as the BibFrame Primer document, and that came out at the end of 2012. It's a fun read, as you can imagine. It's great if you need to get to sleep and are struggling. It's available free, obviously, on the Library of Congress website. If you're struggling to find it, if you put in Miller, and I love it when people, this is such a librarian cataloguer thing to say, I love it when people have got unusual surnames. So one of the authors is called Ogbuji, so which is Ogbuji. So if you put in Miller, Ogbuji, and then bib frame, that's the document that will come up. And as it says in its introduction, although it's important to understand the bib frame initiative and the proposed model in a larger context, within the library community it's equally important to consider this document as a starting point upon which the community will continue to build. When reading about the bib frame model, it is clear that much remains to be done. And again, I don't know, I've not been up close to EAD for a long time, but my feeling from friends is that that's possibly true of EAD as well, even after all these years. It seems that it's still in the process of being built.
There's a new one about to come out.
So that's really something to look forward to. So I don't know, like, if it's worth going into any more detail about those kind of high level things. I don't know if you want to like have a discussion about that, or you know, what's most useful. Do you want to talk about like what's different? How does it look different on the ENDS catalogue, or what is useful to people?
Why are publishers not creators? Sorry, thinking about the theoretical level.
At the theoretical level, it's still, I mean, that's a really good point. We're still wired into this model. This is me with my historical bibliography hat on. We're still wired into a model in which things are the work of one person's mind. And we still are wedded as libraries to this idea that if something is created by a corporate body, somehow it has less authority, in the kind of authority with a small a sense of the word, than something that springs from the mind of one individual. And yet when we look at that historically, you know, we have to thank Ben Jonson and Shakespeare for the birth of the author, and we can thank the World Wide Web perhaps for the death of the author, and that's quite a short period, isn't it? You know, you're talking 16th century to very, very beginning of the 21st century, and you look at how long there's been human beings creating things. That seems quite a blip, but it's still accepted as a norm within the library world that the usual thing will be one person will write something, and the publisher is just some form of agent over there. I mean, it's a huge thing that we're actually talking about giving publishers their own authority files. Pretty much all libraries have a controlled vocabulary list for publishers, but this concept of authority files has been floating around at least as long as I have.
I was going to say, so does Ferber, as well as dealing with the sort of the, what I might call bibliographic entity,
Yeah.
Does Ferber also deal with other entities or concepts or whatever?
You could apply it to other things, and certainly there's a whole section in it that talks about relationships, and so within Ferber there's a model for the people who create things, the people that are related to things. Something that people who know archivists have been pushing for years and years and years within the library community is the concept of the family. So there's a concept that comes through Ferber of the family, and the example that we're always given is, you know, the Austen family, as in the Austen family papers. And obviously, you know, standard like literary archivism, if you like, couldn't really exist without the concept of the family, but it's taken us till, you know, Ferber coming out to actually acknowledge that that is a thing, and that it's quite an important thing. And there's also the bits that's the other thing I didn't say. RDA hasn't been written in its entirety. So quite apart from the fact that it's written in quite strange language and is being revised by Christine Oliver in Canada into proper English, there's also huge sections of it that just don't exist. So there's a really tantalising bit where it talks about objects and how, you know, obviously materials could be related to objects. I don't know what that means. That chapter hasn't been written. But it's hinted at in quite a tantalising way within RDA that they want to have that power. And I guess they're thinking about libraries that are piggybacking with museums and looking at, I mean, one of the things that they've done is surveys of the different schema that are used. And there's quite a wide variety. So the UK one, the latest one I've got is from 2010. And while the majority, 80% of 90% of people surveyed used Mark 21. There are still people using UK Mark, which is an unsupported standard. Over 10% use UK Mark. And then there's a full range, so you've got about 10% using Dublin Core. Looks to me about, as I'm looking at a graph, looks to me about 2% using MODS or MADS, about maybe 3% using EAD or EAC. Onyx, the publisher's standard, is being used by about the same amount. And then Unimark, which is the kind of European flavour, seems to be used. And then, and this always shocks the students, nearly 8% of libraries said that they also used in-house/local standards. And it's not clear, because of the way they collected the data, whether that's, you know, what I would consider the norm if you're in a specialist library and have the luxury of, you know, not just ingesting records, but being able to tart them up with kind of specialist features for your users, or if they just have some crazy grunty homemade system that they use. You know, I've seen really quite prestigious organisations that have just built their own catalogue in Access, and that's what they use. So there's quite a plethora of these standards, and within the library world, as well as reaching out to the World Wide Web, it's trying to reach out to other communities. And the actual systems that we use vary. So I mean, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 different library management systems that came back in that survey. The one that's used most frequently is Aleph, with Voyager close behind, but that's only, so the most used one in the UK is Aleph, and that's just over 20%, not quite 21%. And each of these library management systems have got their own things that you need to tweak with. Okay, so we really are, I think we're a community that says we're all doing the same thing, and we're all trying to do the same thing, and we're aspiring to do the same thing, but we all have our own kind of things that we need to tweak. And even at the British Library there's tweaks, because it's an Anglo-American standard, so you know, it's not like in Mr. Panizzi's day where he could just add an extra rule, and that's why he ended up at 91, because he thought he could do it in much less, and oh no, I need another rule. They can't quite do that, it all has to be done in consultation with other people. So I honestly can't think, I would like to think that the Library of Congress must use absolutely standard RDA. But I don't know that I want to pursue that. I don't know, I think it might break my heart. It's like I don't want to go to Jerusalem and see the site of the True Cross, because something inside me would die. And I feel like I'd like to go to the Library of Congress, but I don't want to look too closely at its data, because I suspect that, like, I remember the day that Alan Danskin showed me some of the British Library stuff that was non-standard, and I did feel as a little 22-year-old something inside me just died a little bit. This idea that standardisation wasn't standard just blew my mind.
Well, yeah. I mean, the library has data that goes back a very long way, and it's a mess.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. It's like within the library world, we've kind of denied the hybridisation. So the thing that sort of amazed me was this idea that Cutter had said in the end of the 19th century that it's okay if you've got cards that are coming in and the standard isn't quite right, it won't bother the end users. And I must admit, I've never had an end user go, I couldn't find that because this was the wrong standard, this was catalogued in Onyx and you just ingested it. You know, I can't even think of how an end user would notice that. All an end user knows is that they've found something or they've not found something. But we sort of ignored that advice from Cutter, and we went through this period from the 1960s until really this year, where when we changed standards, whether it was content standards or whether it was a library management system upgrade, we would do this massive batch modify and kid on that all the records, you know, that they had always been expressed in the way that they're expressed now. And I have a record from the British Library catalogue that I know has got bits of Panizziism in it because of the way, like, the pagination is expressed, and it's coming straight out of Panizzi's rules. And it's just obviously, it's a little record that's obviously failed a batch modify. And I love to show that to students because it just tells that story of that having happened. But now we say we're not going to batch modify, we're going to do what Cutter advised, and the hybrid catalogue, the hybrid environment is with us to stay. And the truth is, it always has been, we've just kidded on it wasn't. So, I don't know, is that the sort of thing that you were wanting to
I think I'm
hear
getting
about?
a picture, but I think I'm also not getting a picture because it's just so big, isn't it? It's just such a big subject.
Yeah.
Are there any questions, Sophie?
How are we doing for time? It's 20 to 7.
20 to 7. We've got 10 minutes for questions if people want questions.
I'm trying to think of framing of it. It hasn't quite turned into a question. So
Well, the comment is good.
And then it might turn into
That sounds good.
The thought that kept it. I really enjoyed your presentation. You brought out a lot of the issues very much more clearly from me. So I can see how certain problems have developed, and I can look at the library catalogue and think, that's different. Why do you get so many images in packed on the same thing that don't look the same?
Exactly.
You can see that. What was it? This thought that kept running through my head was the reality has clashed with the dream to a very great extent.
Definitely.
Possibly far more so in libraries than in archives, because the ambitions have been great, and it sort of ought to be so much simpler than it is somehow.
Definitely.
I was just thinking this the other. So that was meant to be turning into a question, but it hasn't got.
No,
I think it is a question,
true.
because I think there's questions around distribution in as much as our libraries have always been about sharing.
Mm-hmm.
That was the whole point. Distributed cataloguing was the whole point from the very beginning. And now you have the technology to make distributed cataloguing even more of a reality than it was.
And we're moving
and we don't
further
seem
away
able
from
to
it.
do it.
What I was really trying to get back to was I think you mentioned quite in the beginning that somebody who said that the most minute and stringent rules and so uniformity, which is perhaps some ways the rules need to be so minute and stringent that they're so complicated that people have difficulty applying them. Most of it.
Definitely.
In the archive sector, we've generally been either a bit more sloppy or a bit more flexible, depending on your point of view. I was thinking that the other.
It's a bit more theoretical. I think that's the thing. I think, we've got a big thing at the moment about, cataloguer judgment, and it's like, oh my goodness, cataloguers have to make their own judgment. Whereas archivists, I would like to see the archive administrator that could tell an archivist that they couldn't make their own judgment. I could just imagine, like in my days at the Public Record Office, it's just very much, your collection is your collection and you know it better than anybody else, and whether it's creating a hand list or throwing out a collection description onto the web or going out and giving a talk to promote it, you are the archivist and you're promoting that material. You're not seen by anybody as a drone that's just sitting doing this, and I'm not playing the piano, I'm like the monkey at the typewriter. And I think due it's 40%, I need to get some time to write an article about and look into that a bit more and write about due it's 40%, because I don't know when that changed. I don't know where this idea, if Jewett said, looking at Harvard and the Smithsonian and the other libraries in the area, they've only got 40% comparison. Why did we ever think that distributed cataloguing would be the main thing? I mean, it's a thing and it's a good thing, but even the man who thought of it didn't think that that was the majority of cataloguing. So we should have stuck closer with the archivists.
Do you think, slight tangent there, but do you think that difference, that sort of key difference which you made there between the mass-produced thing and the more unique thing? Yeah. And I mean, there's lots of grey there, but yes, I mean that's a key thing. Do you think in this linked world, do you think there's do you think that difference will be reflected somehow in that key world? So, for example, at the library, the National Bibliography has been set free, as it were, as linked open data. Yeah. And I sort of own the archives manuscript data, and I'm trying to have a conversation with I want to set this free too. Yeah. I want it out there, and they're saying, well, why? Nobody wants to buy it. And so and I'm saying, well, because it's really good, interesting data, and it will bring people back to us. Definitely. Is my argument. It's just about sending it out there and bringing people back to our collections. But I mean, do you think there's anything? Can you help my argument there?
Yeah, I think there's a lot in the digital humanities scholarship that really is involved with that. I mean, I can think of colleagues, some of Jenny and my colleagues would pounce on that data, because the intellectual content, I mean, one of my great arguments, and we've got a PhD student who's pursuing this further, is that documentation is a form of text and can be analysed in the same way as it, or using slightly different techniques, but it can be analysed as text. And I would hesitantly put forward the theory that archival records even more so, you're not hemmed in with this kind of closed structure. And so I would have thought that data as a corpus is something that should be out there for scholarship. And in the same way, my goodness, if people are interested on blooming Google Ngrams, how much more interesting is the archival data of a national collection? So I think the data as itself, as a data set, is something that should be given its own life. I'm looking at Jenny because I know she's set up the digital curation module.
I think it's difficult. I think it's about what you do with it. People can't see it. I mean, that's the trouble with the whole semantic web. You can't see the benefit. You just don't know what it does. It's there, and it's just like we publish our data in a different format. So what?
Exactly.
Because we can't see what it enables us to do.
Exactly.
So I think that things like there's a project called SNAC, Social Networks in Archival Context, which is it's actually using it. It's not doing it through linked data. It's doing it more through EAC, but it's showing people that the ability to visualise all the relationships that we have recorded in archival data enables you to see social networks through time.
Given them our
Yeah. So if I think we need more of those sort of projects, so people can actually see the benefit of what you can do if you publish your data, if you let it go, and because we have a lot of, we record a lot of data a lot of the time as librarians and archivists, and all these relationships which we are recording, maybe not very effectively in MARC, but we're starting to record more effectively. Those relationships can be used, and there's a lot of power in them, but we can't utilise them, and people don't realise that.
Absolutely.
And it's our skill sets, right? So one of the things that I love about working for Jenny and I work is that there are the people there who've got, the text encoding initiative skills, and they've got the big data skills there. And I think that's what I would find difficult if I were still in the field, would be not knowing those people. I wouldn't necessarily know where to start. So I think if I were you, I would be talking to our colleagues at UCL Centre for Digital Humanities. I would be talking to at King's. I don't know if you're in touch with. They've got their Centre for Digital Humanities, but they also have Search, which is headed up by Richard Gartner. And I think it would be a good idea have him over to lunch, and Melissa Terrace, who's our director, and maybe Andrew, who heads up the one at King's, because I think it's getting those people in. And I think the British Library, the National Archives, the National Archives are doing quite a lot to open up their data, aren't
release
they?
their data. They do release data sets.
Well, we have, as though. So when I say we, my former we, release the public sector information regulations apply, and that's going to apply to archives once they came in. They come in, well, you only have to get some requests from people for provision of the data and the data set, and you'd have to have a very good reason to provide it. So the imperative for the change may actually come from the private sector, move us to the knowledge economy, rather than from the in-house developers of the data.
Maybe.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So we have digital scholars on one point, which I think is sort of the close area one would expect to be interested in the data. And as you say, I think very archival data is much more texty by definition. I think.
And more intellectual. I don't mean that in a derogatory sense towards myself and other cataloguers, but just what you're actually recording as an archivist really is the intellectual outpourings of somebody, whether it's somebody's personal papers or an institution's papers. What you're writing is intellectually profound, and is a sales tool for that.
Really? Not always.
No.
Sometimes it's you're trying to get physical intellectual control of the material, so that you know what you have and other people can know what you have. I'm not sure how much profound intellectual thought there is necessarily in it. There is on occasion. Yes.
I think not in the process. I think as a process, I feel the same about rare books cataloguing. As a process, it's documenting stuff, and that's not an intellectual process, but it generates intellectual content. When you look at some of the digital projects that have come out that are entirely reliant. You couldn't complete some certain projects. I'm not naming them because there's a podcast on, but they're entirely reliant on the metadata structure that's in place behind them. And I think that's the thing that maybe we're quite similar as librarians and archivists, is that we downplay our role in the creation of that intellectual content. I think that's just my opinion.
I wanted to ask you how you saw, what you saw as the relationship between the work which the cataloguers are doing and the metadata, which might be associated with the original material.
Yeah, I mean, I would take that as quite a kind of process-driven thing, right? So I think you have to have the decent catalogue records for the kind of prosaic thing of getting the book off the shelf, but increasingly, grassroots cataloguers who may not in fact be professionally trained need to understand where that data that they're inputting is going. And I think when it goes a bit wrong, it can almost always be traced back to poor training in-house. And that's the thing, one of the things that's great with the RDA toolkit, it's available online, and a lot of places, including the British Library, have put out the workflows that they have available for their in-house staff. And I think that is a really powerful tool, because a lot of the time metadata is rubbish as it pertains to books. I don't feel qualified to talk about archives, but metadata is rubbish as it pertains to books, because there's some little person on a minimum wage who hasn't been trained properly that thinks it doesn't matter if I make a typo here, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I don't identify that there's an addition statement, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that I don't record, and this is like fatal obviously, it doesn't matter if I don't record the copyright on this, just doesn't matter. And further down the line, a bigger project fails because you haven't got that. If you haven't got the record to harvest into the metadata, you haven't got the project. But where you get funding to actually pay people appropriately, that's probably a good point to kind of draw to a close, isn't it? Getting money to pay grassroots cataloguers is hen's teeth.
I don't think that's something we have in common.
Don't think any of us would oppose paying people a decent wage.
And what if everyone's got one final question, or
comment? You can comment. You're allowed to have your own thoughts and comment.
I mean, this isn't fully formed, but I guess I'm thinking of, if we're moving away from this idea of a monolithic structure to this more linked data structure, we also have to think about when we put these records online, that they're not going to fit the old static model where they just sit on your website and don't change. We already are in this Web 2.0 where that record is getting changed by the user. So are we addressing that really important aspect of these records with this new RDA?
They're trying to. There's certainly an attempt being made, and I'm going to be really annoying and say ask me again in 5 years, because it really is. It's that level of implementation detail. And I think what we've seen with the old standard is we had it for so long that I think that's why we were able to employ people at very low wages with huge numbers to push through. And what we're really seeing is people being skilled up, and I'm hearing more and more about people getting upgraded in post because they're having to get to grips with this. And I hope that will happen more and more, because I think that's the power that we need. It's the power of the person analysing the material that's really going to implement those changes. And without that power, I think we'll see negative consequences.
I found that the library community is very reticent to the idea of their records being changed in any way after they. I understand the hesitance behind that, but it's also really powerful. I think this younger generation of librarians coming in might have a big.
I'm not sure. I think it'd be interesting to talk without the podcast as to what institutions you're thinking of, because the places that I'm aware of are really excited about this. And certainly when you look at places like Cambridge University Library, who've done a tremendous amount of work in putting out materials to educate people on RDA, they are really excited about the power of this. And the British Library obviously is really excited about it. So I think I always fight the fight for Alan Danskin and his colleagues at the BL, because they're even older than me. They're sort of my next generation up, and they are really pushing for this, and they've sat on the committees to make this happen. So I think it's I don't know that age is a factor, but I think flexibility may be, and I think reflexibility may be, and I think it gets harder. The more you're wired into a structure that works, it's like every time you get a new update for Microsoft Word, or like my phone provider for the past 3 months wants me to update, and I'm like, no, I don't want to update it, because when I update it, something will break, and I don't have the time to fix the thing that will break. And I think we're all just so pared back to the bone now, staffing wise. That if something breaks, if you implement something new and it breaks something that's already working, well, you have the budget to cope with that. I don't know, I mean, when I worked, I was coming out of libraries at the time when you still had on big projects, you had to put in a contingency budget. And more I'm talking to very senior colleagues who are quite stressed because they're not allowed a contingency budget in their plan for implementing stuff at this level. How can you implement an absolute fundamental philosophical change and you don't have a contingency budget? And I talk to my students about stealth librarianship and how you can, try and get around that and build in your own contingency budget. But 20 years ago, when I was starting out in the civil service, it was like you couldn't get a project approved without the right size of contingency budget, because it was accepted that things would go wrong and you'd have to fix them. I think that's what's going.
And there's also something similar in the archive world. The catalogue is the authority. We are very we take a lot of care to construct our catalogue and to make sure it is accurate. We don't want people changing it willy-nilly. Or adding things that, more subjective things, like I really like this.
My family is the most common tag. When you introduce user tagging, my family is the most common tag.
But we're trying to get over that a little bit. There is a reaction against that. So yes, archivists are doing that, but I think the way that it's been done is to think about provenance and to think about making sure that there is a differentiation between data that has been created and checked and data that hasn't.
Yeah, there's a way to use it while making that difference.
But our users tend to, when asked, say that they like the fact that they know that this catalogue is TNA's catalogue or the British Library's catalogue. So it's not just the professional. It's about authoritas. It's
about
very much about authority, absolutely. But I think there is room, as Jenny says, there really is room to bring in other things.
User generated.
But it's also about just letting it go. I mean, that's what you're talking about. You want to let your data go. And then who knows what will happen to it.
No, that's true. So you've still got a master copy of it, but once it's out there, and that is what you're accepting, and you might suddenly go in there and say, and then we'll have to think about licensing and those sorts of issues. But interesting.
Well, thank you very much. I think we should say thank you to Anne.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.